Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from Prince George, British Columbia. This is a session of podcasting that deals with BC forest industry in transition, and we have a very, very special guest today. His name is Jeff McWilliams. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, John.
Now, you are a registered professional forester. You got a degree in forestry from UBC, I believe. Tell us a little bit about your background, Jeff.
Yeah, sure, John.
Were you born in Prince George, or in BC, or a little bit about your background and then about your career?
Sure. Well, I'll start way back a little bit. I'm a third generation professional forester. My grandfather was one of the first professional foresters in the province. He had an interesting career in government. One of his most illustrious things was that he started the BC nursery program in 1940, early 1940s, to reforest the Campbell River Sayward Fire. He then went on to become a deputy minister for parks and recreation in the Wacky government in the 70s. My father was a professional forester as well, a graduate from UBC. Started off as a forester and then went into the manufacturing business, where he spent the most of his career managing sawmills, custom cut and remanufacturing facilities in various parts of BC. Tremendous love of Western red cedar. Yellow cedar was very prominent in that kind of manufacturing. And then I came along. I was probably introduced to the forests and the outdoors through our property up in the Cariboo, which we were lucky to get. And then also my grandfather and my father's interest in the outdoors and forestry. So I wasn't originally going to be a forester. I was going to be a pilot. But my eyes weren't good enough in the day to be a pilot. And so after kicking the tires and taking some time off and things, I built a log cabin up in the Cariboo. Kind of got to love wood even more and loved the outdoors. So I then decided I'd dabble in a forestry education and see where that took me. I did graduate from UBC in 1985, and I took 1 year as a visiting student at the University of Brunswick, which was excellent. Gave me a good perspective of a broader base to what forestry is in outside of a BC context. And then I started as a silviculturist for International Forest Products. It was Wannock Industries at the time on the coast. I did 3 or 4 years working with a small group managing a significant reforestation program. And then I got a chance to move into some sawmill management, and I took the opportunity. I did got my log grading ticket and moved into the sawmills, and I was helping buy and trade logs in amongst Interfor's various different mills at the time. And then I got to work in the sawmill, quality control and line supervisor, and got a good idea of how a big hemball whitewood mill on the coast operated at the time, custom cutting big old Sitka spruce from high to Gouai, amongst other things. That was also an interesting time when the first second growth harvesting in the late 80s was starting to happen, and how value added, in my opinion, got to show another part, which was that you took a standard size gang log and you sorted it 16 different ways to export some, to custom cut some, to run some through mills. Got a really good idea of the early kinds of ways you could generate value from something that was seen to be a commodity to start with. But then I experienced one of the things that happens in the forest industry. The big mill that I was working in the late 80s was closed. Literally within a week or 2 weeks, it was closed. It no longer had a fiber supply, couldn't make money, and there was a good real estate market for the land. And so I was literally out of a job within a couple of months. And then I had a look at my career and decided, you know what, I've learned a lot about different things, and I decided that I needed to go back to forestry as a main theme in my career. And I was lucky enough through a personal friendship with Bruce Blackwell that we started working together. And so I'm also third generation forester, but I also married to a forester. My wife Eleanor is a forestry biometrician. very much involved in growth and yield and financial analysis and inventories in BC. We own our own company and consult to a wide range of fellow consulting companies as well as government and industry. I do most of my work through the Blackwell group and really enjoy that. It's been great to learn the fire piece and some of the other things that Bruce has got, and I think that hopefully he's got something out of working with me on more of the what I would call industrial forest management side of things as well. So yeah, that's kind of where I've been for the last 35 years. I get to practice all throughout BC. I'm probably the generalist in the company. I call myself a silviculturist, but I have experience in all sorts of different aspects of forestry. And now I try to put it all together, John, in what does it mean to me? What would I do if I was king? And trying to look at ways we can sort through this very challenging times that we're in to move forward.
Exactly. I love your background, Jeff, because for a number of reasons is that I was born in Holland in 1940 actually, and so I'm 82 and 3/4, I guess, nearly. Last week I said 82 and a half. Now I'm 82 and 3/4, nearly 83. I'm just a number, right? I'm still extremely active, but my dad worked and I like your background because of your dad, your grandfather having a forest background, and then, but your career really was going to be a pilot. It's very similar to mine. My grandfather was a master carpenter. My dad managed a small lumber mill, when I was already 12 years old, I loved the lumber industry, and we had a little mill in the town where my dad managed, and I used to go down there and watch the logs, and the logs were being imported from Central Europe into the little towns that broke it down into lumber, and from there and then further manufactured into moldings and all the other things they use in houses in Europe, I was very much attracted to it. I was not a very good student in school. I failed grade 3 and I failed grade 7 3 times. And then they said, what are we going to do with this guy? So they said, well, maybe send him to the mentally challenged school. Fortunately, they didn't do that. So they said, well, let's make him a furniture maker. That's what they did. And that became a real benefit to me once I followed my dreams. And my dream was, we were liberated by the Canadian Army, April the 12th, 1945. And from that point, I was 5 years old. From that point forward, I always knew I was going to the land of my heroes, Canada. Just a matter of time. Then I was going to go when I was 17. My parents wouldn't let me. I was then drafted into the Air Force. I wanted to be a pilot, but my education was not solid enough, I guess, or whatever it was. They put me in special forces, which was interesting to say the least, but it was a good experience for 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years. And then finally when I came out of the Air Force, I wound again starting to work for the largest importer of lumber in Western Europe, a company by the name of William Pond that had 35 subsidiaries, major importer of lumber, and I became part of their auditing team somehow and learned a lot of things there. But still, I wanted to do something on my own and go to Canada. And what I wanted to do is go to build my own lumber mill. So I had kind of got more and more information on British Columbia. I knew I wanted to go to British Columbia. And so I went to British Columbia then in July of 1965. And when I came to Vancouver, talked to a fellow there. I couldn't speak English, so that had in the immigration department that had a German background. I could speak some German. I told him what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a lumber mill. He said, go to Prince George. 1965, that's where they're building the mills, that's where the pulp mills, that's where the opportunities are. It's a boom town. That's what I did. When I came to Prince George here in July of 1965, I had exactly $25.47 and a dream. And underneath it, it says, my employees got me this actually, but it says underneath what I did have: attitude, avoid negative, passion, love the industry, work ethic, and then success will follow. So that's what I did. Started out with my $25.47, started piling lumber, clean up man, did all the other things going through the lumber industry, and then 10 years later started a company called Brink Forest Products, which is now part of the Brink group of companies. In normal times, we probably would be the largest secondary manufacturer in Canada, and have gone through all the ups and downs, which we will talk about in our discussion. But I love Canada. I love British Columbia. It's the land of opportunity. Forest industry is a bit like a roller coaster, as we all know, but still, although there are obviously lots of challenges in the industry right now, and have been because of, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, pine beetle, fires, other reductions in the annual allowable cut have resulted in about 40 to 45 sawmills shutting down, about 6 or 7 pulp mills, pellet plants, and value-added manufacturers. So it's very much an industry in transition. And so, as being an observer, observing the industry for nearly 60 years, right from the time that I came here, I was extremely, amazingly surprised when I saw these big mills, but the first thing, got hired by a mill, and I looked at their burner conveyor, and I could not believe what was happening. More than half the log would go up the burner. The other thing that I had not been used to is that my dad managed a small lumber company in Holland, and I grew up in the culture that do not step on a piece of lumber, respect it. That's how I grew up. Where here, with all due respect, I found a lot of times that was not the case. Although the lumber species that we had here, I had in my period in Holland, experience in Holland, secondary manufacturing. I had spent also some time in Sweden, seeing the lumber being imported from there, the rough lumber, and further remanufactured or value-added manufactured in Holland for then the building industry. And the species in Sweden, very similar, as you know, of as the interior of British Columbia. Some of the best species around for further manufacturing and for lumber manufacturing. Coast obviously is different, but so I've always been surprised and always looked at why are we not doing more with the fiber that we have, and then gradually, as I got to know the industry from 1965 forward, the coastal industry in particular became smaller and smaller and smaller, and especially with the species that we have, Douglas fir, cedar, and all the other species that you refer to, where in the interior it is more SPF or spruce, pine, balsam fir, that I could never quite follow. The industry was always in transition, starting already in the early 60s likely, but when I came here in 1965, it was in the process of consolidating and growing, but all we did is mainly manufacture dimension lumber, directed to the US market. And the interesting part about it, Bruce, I'm kind of telling you this as a preamble to when I'm listening to your background that was very much industry related in all the different segments, that when I was still in Holland working for one of the largest importing companies there in Western Canada, in Western Holland, every so often we would get Canadian manufacturers visiting us in Holland, mainly from the interior of BC, and we love the Canadians in Holland. We just love them because they liberated us and they are extremely popular when they come and visit us. But for us as lumber manufacturers, what they wanted us to do is buy dimension lumber so we could build houses like they do here. That was in the early 60s. Not much has changed in terms of marketing in my perspective in the interior of British Columbia. The coast has dramatically changed, obviously, for all the reasons we will talk about. But looking at the interior, that most of the dimension lumber, we still are mainly 2x4 manufacturers, meant to be for building the normal houses in the US market. And then every so often we find other markets like China, and they starting to buy lumber, but they are bottom feeders. They buy mainly low grade that they then further remanufacture into furniture that we end up buying at Costco, hypothetically speaking. Or be looking for other places where we can start selling 2x4s. We have become the best manufacturer of low-paying 2x4s that a lot of times nobody wants. And then I was quite involved in the value-added sector. I was the founding president of the BC Council Value-Added Manufacturers Association, which had 800 members in the late mid-90s, but disappeared because of policy, government policy primarily, where it is now today to virtually not much left of the secondary manufacturing sector. So that all being said, it gives you a bit of my background as to where I think we are and where can we go from here and what does it look like. Obviously, we already know that the annual allowable cut in the province of British Columbia has gone from an average of about 60 million cubic meters down to something somewhat less than 40 million cubic meter because of the pine beetle, spruce beetle, Douglas fir beetle in the interior to a certain extent, fires from 2018, 2019, and then obviously set-asides for the old growth deferral program and other policy issues. Then a certain portion of the annual allowable cut is designated to First Nations. I'm a supporter of that, and they're getting part of the revenue as well. So in the meantime, if I look around, we have lost 40 to 45, probably another 3, 4, 5 mills to go. So I say it's usually closer to 45 mills have disappeared. Most of the investment has been made by the major companies that control most of the allowable cut in the US Southeast or in Europe somewhere, and are not investing much in BC and further manufacturing or in the primary manufacturing sector. So that all being said, you have such a broad experience, especially with your relationship with Blackwell and Associate, and that I'm kind of laying that out for you. That then being said, you have so much experience with Blackwell and Associates and other things that you have done in terms of forest management, and then in your own company with your wife's unique skill sets, that I don't know how you called it, but that deal in forest strategy. The big question today is that I'm trying to lay on the table from my perspective is where do we go from here? And then the other part that I'm saying, that kind of looking back to my experience in Europe, that with the annual allowable cut being at around 40 million or less cubic meters, then we have the midterm in which we're trying to hopefully get back to gradually raising the annual allowable cut. But we should be investing more in the forest, in thinning and other things. I'm thinking Sweden, for instance, that had very similar issues that we have, where they, about 30, 40 years ago, had far too much capacity, not enough fiber. Then they changed forest policies, although the structure is different there, but they did. And they probably growing 50% more per hectare, if not more, than we do. And now where they are is something on an annual allowable cut from a physical area about the size of what we have designated for timber in BC. But they now have not enough capacity, and the market is doing well, and they have made major changes. I don't see us doing that. I believe that forest policy is still not designated to the longer term. Appurtency, or this, the forest industry being uniquely different from other places, belongs to you and me, the people, and we have to be keenly aware of that. There is a social obligation, and at the end of the day, we have to try to extract as much social and economic value from that resource as we can.
So yeah, sure. Let me jump in, John. I think that you remind me of having visits with my dad in his retired and later years. And I think that reflection and history is an important place to start when you try to understand where you are today and where you think you should go. And history, not only in the context of British Columbia, where we have both had a long careers now, but you also have to look back to other jurisdictions who have done this before us. And one of the interesting things that I always reflect back, I had a professor of ecology at UBC, Hamish Kimmets, and he said something very profound about sort of the history of the development of forestry in the world. He said the typical development pattern is exploitation. When there's a perceived unlimited source of fiber, there's usually not the infrastructure in place. There's need to generate economic activity to grow civilization, to grow an infrastructure that people can live and build cities and stuff. So there's a natural tendency. The forests look limitless. The fish look limitless in the ocean. There's lots of different natural resource analogies that you can go to that say, look, we can take what we want and we can turn this wild land into something that's more inhabitable, and we can use the economic benefit to prosper. And that seems to be a common thread. Then we sort of, in other parts of the world, certainly, I think we've got there in BC now, but then there gets to be perceived shortage. You get to where you've run out of this limitless supply. People start to ask questions about this exploitation and whether there's a better way. And there's more values that need to be, got out of this natural, bounty. And so you start to get administrative forestry starting. You get to start getting some regulation. You get to start doing this happening. And then the third phase is actually where you get more enlightened forest management, where you actually get social, environmental, and economic forestry that comes together and meets better the will of the owners, the public. And I think that the problem here that we've struggled with in BC is not that we're, not only repeating the past in terms of how this has happened in Europe, in Eastern United States, in Eastern Canada. Now it's happening here. I hear it may be happening in Russia, and it's just seemingly continuation of this process. And the struggle in my career, has been that I keep hoping that we're going to get out of this sort of administrative phase of this transition from exploitation to true management. and get on with the business of helping our owners, the public, figure out what an appropriate balance between economic, environmental, and social is, and then allowing foresters to go out and actually start growing forests for those multiple values. Silviculture is the art and science of growing trees to meet the objectives of the owners. Okay, what I've learned is one of the biggest impediments to why we're where we are now is we foresters haven't had enough of an opportunity, haven't made the education process happen. There hasn't been enough collaboration between the owners and the people who should know best professionally how to manage forests for whatever value, to figure out the pros and the cons, the trade-offs that are available to end up at that, that more enlightened management. And I think part of this is the struggle is, now is who is the public. Public ownership is both a jewel, but it's also led to tragedy of the commons in multiple different ways. Fisheries I brought up, East Coast cod fishery, Pacific salmon, now forests. The problem here is it's owned by everybody, but not willfully managed by anybody. And that lack of management focus is, I think, at the heart of where we're at. And so when you ask the question, well, what does Jeff think we can do from here? I think foresters have a great ability to manage forests to meet a multiple set of values. One of the key learnings, though, is that we can't do everything everywhere. So there's been a multiple use philosophy in forestry for a while, but the problem is that multiple use forestry philosophy has been on every hectare, or too much has been tried to be got out of every hectare, when there are significant trade-offs between growing a forest for a timber emphasis, for example, versus a habitat emphasis. And you can't do both very well, inefficient as can be on the same hectare. And yet that's what we've continued to try to do. So we are finally starting to learn the forest landscape level planning process that came out of the old growth paper by Gorley and Merkel. One of the recommendations in there is that we start to get on with a zoning approach to our forest land, and that we not try to get everything out of everywhere, that we have some conservation areas that we set aside and do very little on. We have this multiple use area where we can do more, we can divide up the emphasis within that, but we're going to still try to hit a mixed balance. And then we're going to have a timber emphasis where we really try to go at what you've alluded to, some of the more intensive forest management techniques that have been successful in Sweden and other places to get more fiber out of a smaller land base. And so we've struggled mightily with that. And I think that when I reflect back on the big picture, back to this public ownership piece, I think we have to really look at the fact that are we all equal in this democracy? Should Jeff McWilliams and his neighbors who live in North Vancouver get to have an equal say in the management of the forests in the Prince George area or the Terrace area or anywhere in the hinterland? And what I'm trying to get at is not trying to be, break the basket of what democracy is, but I think that overall what I've learned is local populations are much, much more respectful of a balance to an approach. They live there, they recreate, they fish, they get their water. They are the stewards, they're the ones we should trust to have more of a say in the balance that we want to achieve from managing forests. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think we're getting a lot of noise in Victoria now in our provincial government. There's even outside of British Columbia, social media, all sorts of pressure coming from people that really don't have the interest that they need to have. They don't have skin in the game. And I'm a big believer that when you get down to the hard trade-offs that we're talking about, John, because we are in a place where if we don't make change quickly, we are going to have some significant problems in terms of a lot of different things. Economy, environment, all sorts of aspects that we've trusted our forest to be part of. We really are going to have some problems. So we need to quickly get our act together and figure out how to hopefully regionally and locally end up with balance that are the local people have more of a say over, that we can get comfortable. And I think my experience with local, smaller towns and urban, environments is they generally do care a lot. And I think that if they get talked to the right way and the tools are available to them to say that we want this much timber, we want this much non-timber, we, laid out in a traded off way, that they would have a much more successful outcome for giving foresters like myself and others the chance to achieve the goals that they're seeking to get.
So there then, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, comes the concept of appurtency, which is not always clear what that means, other than, in my mind, what it means is a social obligation. If you have the privilege of access to fiber, timber, then with that go certain social obligations. It's not yours because it belongs to the public.
That's the history, John, of how we have built our industry and built our province. But it broke down a long time ago, as you know.
I know. But now what I say is that, okay, then where do we go from here? So what I say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that step one is to say, look at our forest, this amazing province that grows fiber so well, even with the least amount of work of doing it, is doing so well, because I see it here, as you have seen it, east of Prince George, where we had the Bowen spruce beetle kill. If I go there 40 years later now, that the replanting, it is amazing how well the land will do the job. I feel a lot of times what is lacking here, respectfully, is that we in the province of British Columbia, every 4 years we have, hypothetically speaking, an election. We either put in a left-leaning government or a right-leaning government, and then we have a minister of forest, with all due respect, which we then change every 2 years, and now we got a new one and a new one. We lack, in my opinion, a longer-term strategy, which would be, to the best of my knowledge, and especially now with First Nations being owners of the land as well, correctly, as they should be, we should look at this together in the longer-term strategy. What is to the benefit of the people that own the land, all the people that own the land, and to have a sustained forest policy, not one that changes every 2 years because there is a new minister of forest. Now we have changes here. That's step one. And then
absolutely. I think that the structure is outdated, and there's been profound change made in that structure since it was beneficial to us. The social license you mentioned is long gone. The major companies are moving their facilities to where there is timber available. There is all this happening, and I don't blame them. It's honestly, through the government has asked for them to do this, basically, by the actions of what we've done. So we've got to change it. And the fundamentals of this are, I'm pretty, I look at the Pacific, the U.S. Southeast as a very interesting model. It's private forest land with independently owned mills. Now, I'm not an advocate necessarily of having to go to privatization of the land in BC. I think there's a way to do things, but one of the key concepts ever since the U.S. softwood lumber tariffs came on is, I've always said, well, when we move forward here, do we really not have two businesses at least, or maybe three? One is growing and managing forests, okay? And that the customers and the products for that is logs and services that come from the forest. Maybe that's good enough as a business. Maybe if we set ourselves up that we have enough suppliers of grown forests, the products coming from the forest, that we will then have mill owners and manufacturers, very entrepreneurial people like yourself, my dad, and others who know how to make money out of a product. And if you show them and you say, I can grow this, John, and I can grow this, what do you like? I think I can do this. Then you match up the entrepreneurial manufacturing power that we have together with the forestry power. You separate those two. And, I've talked to a few CEOs of the forest industry quietly with a beer after, not in the public. And every one of them that I talked to said they are not afraid of that model at all. In other words, the idea that forest tenure has to be tied to manufacturing is an old concept. It no longer is relevant. And what you just imagine, John, if even if it was publicly owned ownership, if you divided up the province into a series of community, First Nations, non-First Nations communities coming together and having multiple tenures that they managed on an area base, and that they supplied a certain amount of wood products to a market, the industry would look at the market and say, here's how much wood we can expect from these different sources over time. Here's the size of a mill that we can build to facilitate the making money from that. I think that's one of the cornerstones of where we need to go. And frankly, I don't really think that big industry is going to argue as much about this as they would have used to. I think that they're kind of tired of this business, and they're on the way out. Frankly, I think they're voting with their feet. And if we are wise, we're going to facilitate this through the First Nations involvement in tenure and forest management. We're going to facilitate more of that community-based management. It has to be area-based. That's another concept, John, that's absolutely critical no matter what. It has to be an area base, and there can only be one plan for that area, and in my mind, one manager, which could be one manager being a coalition or a cooperative or whatever. It can represent a huge amount of people, but the bottom line, there has to be a long-term plan that you allude to long-term. It has to be taken out of the political realm, and it has to be localized, and then you get one implementation of that plan, and you get management of forests in a more
area-based, so that they that do the work can benefit from the take ownership. But I see now, Jeff, and I agree with you 100%, but I see now, in the 60 years that I've been around, nearly 60 years, around this area and watched the forest industry because it's my passion. I love the industry, I love BC, I love the forest industry. And I'm troubled by where we are and where we are not going yet, but we will, I believe, and I will be a proponent of that every single day of the week. Is that if I look around, I look at Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, I look at Chetwynd, I look at Mackenzie, I look at Fort St. James, I look at Stewart Lake, I look at Smithers, I look at Houston. All those communities have lost their mills, and although the timber is still there, but it's simply a sign of that this system that we have doesn't work. And I believe that a long time ago, in the late 80s, early 90s, I was the founding president, as I said to you, of the BC Council of Value-Added Wood Processing. It's not saying that they should be the ones that have the timber, but that innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary is part of the model where things should be going forward. And if I look at government policy, I look at the intentions paper, on the three main objectives of it. First Nations should be more involved. They are, and they should be. No question about that. And I believe they will have about 12 to 15, to as high as maybe 20% of the AAC. They will share in the revenue. I agree with that. From there on in, what are they going to do from there on in terms of what is our values to them? They will make that choice. In terms of communities should be more involved in it, as you were saying earlier. The second element of the intentions paper, in terms of preserving old growth, I agree with that to a certain extent. I'm not an expert, you are. I'm troubled by seeing old growth timber that is maybe 8 inches or 10 inches because it's 150 years old is designated to be old growth. I don't think that that's the right way to go, but there is a way of doing more effective managing of old growth, and I'm not against that. In terms of having more value-added manufacturing, obviously I'm very involved in that, and that has have no value added, increase in value added. And since the intentions paper, well meant by the then Premier John Oregon, the value added sector has further disappeared, by what I suggest is a lack of involvement in stimulating that sector by the COFI, by the Council of
My dad would roll over in his grave listening to this conversation again, because we would commonly talk about the value-added sector and what was required to support a value-added sector. To me, I'm getting so tired of listening to successive governments talk to me about what they're going to do for the value-added sector when they're missing the core pieces of this, which are availability of fiber to on a long-term basis that allows these independent and entrepreneurial facilities to figure out what they've got in front of them, what they can do, and how they can manage their process. So and really what it is, John, is trying to fit a solution, a short-term solution, into something where the framework is broken, which is this whole tenure and major licensee linkage and volume-based approach that we have to this business, and you can't support the value-added sector unless you open up the game, as I talked about, with this idea of separating tenure from manufacturing and allowing entrepreneurs equal access to pay the money to buy the fiber and be able to do their magic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jeff. And for 40 years, I was a member of COFI. I've been on the board of COFI for well over 30 years, the longest serving board member of COFI. I was the vice chair of COFI until about 2 months ago, when the decision was made there will be no support for value-added manufacturing, and the concept that exactly would do that. And I gave notice that on strategic differences, I had to resign from COFI as a member of the board, and as the vice chair. I did that. And because that which we must, even for the benefit of the primaries, we must try to attract entrepreneurship and access to further manufacturing. We can't keep making 2x4 that nobody wants. And that if we want to stimulate investment in value-added manufacturing, I had a value-added company here for nearly 50 years, never got a nickel from the government, no handouts, no subsidy. I don't want any. Employing, when all things were normal, in excess of 400 people, we are wanting to invite investment in value-added manufacturing, then in doing the negotiations that I was part of with COFI in the value-added sector, then there must be reasonable expectation of access to fiber. If you cannot get, I'm not saying tenure for secondary manufacturing, I simply say either lumber or timber in some form or fashion. If you don't have that, nobody's going to invest a nickel. And if you continue with the process that we have now in order to support secondary manufacturers, that is being tight for me, and what I've seen with others, it will decline further and further. Yeah. Being a secondary manufacturer in the province of British Columbia is like having two hands tied behind your back. That's basically what it is.
And I think that's absolutely true. And my dad would totally agree with you. And it's so frustrating to continue to hear what I think is continued rhetoric and about something that's well understood, but nobody's willing to dive into the big issues that need to be solved to deal with that. I want to switch a little bit to, speaking of value, I think, one of our hopes for the recovery of the BC forest industry has to be a value-based recovery. Okay. So I think you would support that. We have to get we have to get more value out of the existing forest, but we also have to grow more valuable forests. And I think this is one of the transitions that we haven't made is when you have an inherent mature forest that's good or pretty good, has a lot of value in it, you have an even idea of value. Yes, some more value, some less, but you go at it with an idea that you've got a pretty valuable resource and you can make money on a lot of it. Once you get down to growing the forest, though, now we're talking about rotation lengths. We're talking about what species to grow,
Yeah.
what regime to grow it under, and all of these things matter when you're generating smaller piece sizes, right? You know,
Exactly.
you know this from your experience in the business.
Yeah.
Is that you can make good money on small diameter lodgepole pine if it's nice and straight and tall.
Absolutely.
But the problem is that we are still focused on a volume-based world. Our AACs, our economic engine is all tied to volume. But
Exactly.
simple fact of the matter is, whatever happens to the AAC, John, is only part of the story.
Yeah.
It's because really an AAC is something nowadays where you've got to put an average value to that cubic meter coming out, every cubic meter coming out. And if the profile is going to be a whole bunch of 40, 30 to 50-year-old stands that are coming into the mills, and if they're not particularly grown well and managed properly, those could end up generating a significantly less valuable product, which means that the total revenue coming from this AAC is going to be substantially less, even if the AAC doesn't go down any further. It's simply that we're moving from an old forest, mature forest profile to a second growth one. And that second growth one, if we're not careful and managing the forest very, very carefully for product value, we're going to find that not only is this AAC a limiting factor, but our communities, our provincial government is going to have a whole lot less tax revenue coming from the same AAC.
Yeah.
That is a profound concern.
Yes.
And I think that one of the things that we need, paradigm shift here, is volume or a sustainable harvest is one thing. You have to have you have to prove that you've got sustainability in basic management of the forest land. But really, we need to have an objective for our timber objective of growing a certain amount of value. And because the value is what's going to generate the taxes, it's going to generate the industrial, the profits for the industry. And I fear we've lost it. And so we get a lot of credit, and I'm totally on side with this. We have a very good program of reforestation in BC where we reforest everything we cut. But frankly, when I look at the value prospect coming out of these forests, I am extremely concerned that we have taken a very simplistic approach to making our cutovers green. So yes, they're nice and green, they have trees on them, but when I look at them and with my mill background and I start to project them forward, they're either got lots of forks and crooks in them, they've got heavy branches coming out of them, they've got all sorts of things that I know don't run well in a sawmill or any manufacturing facility. And so frankly, you get down to the biomass and all the other things that we want to generate out of our forests. The first thing that comes is we have to have a valuable solid wood business in order to have a secondary. You can't run this province of BC on biomass pellets. You can't, the costs are too high. I traveled the world. I've been to Europe, France, Germany. I've been to Brazil. I've been to the Pacific Northwest. There's no way we're competing in where we are in the world on that. We have to have valuable timber.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know we have to have water and we have to have all these other things, but I'm talking about, my concern is we've diversified our reforestation business into something that, it's kind of akin to your financial portfolio. If you took the maximum diversification approach, you'd have a whole bunch of GICs and bonds in your portfolio for the last 20 years. You would have made no money. You didn't lose money, but you don't make any.
No.
And so, of course, there's risk reward to all this, but I fear that we've diversified ourselves right out of the potential of generating value out of our forests, where we're going to try to get a timber objective. And so it's not just that we have the short-term challenges of an AAC that's dropping, John. We've got to reform this idea that simply planting green trees and the more species per hectare on every site, that somehow we can hold that near and dear as being the only objective that we need to worry about. Because I don't really think that's the most enlightened management, and it's probably going to cost us in the long run.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeff, very much so. Is that if I kind of, in fairness, if I kind of look back to when I came off the bus here with my $25.47, couldn't speak the language, didn't know a soul, didn't have a job, and but I had a passion for Canada, BC, and for the forest industry. I could not believe what I was seeing, the amazing timber that we had, and these big sawmills, at least in my mind, then. But what's interesting about it is that not until the early 70s, lodgepole pine was considered to be a weed. Nobody wanted it. And
as Western red cedar was initially when we started to develop on the coast.
And so the point that I'm making is simply that 50 years, 60 years is not a long time ago. So the industry really, when I came, it was in transition. So it went through all these ups and downs, consolidation, where now 5 companies control 75% of the AAC in the province of British Columbia, which means they control it all, factually, if you control 75. We probably see more of the ones that are not blessed with enough tenure as the competition in the industry continues for making the cheapest 2x4s that they can and still keep convincing the rest of the world to build houses like we do so they can find a market for their 2x4s other than the United States. And so that comes directly to the point that we started our conversation with, is that we have to look at this amazing province that has the ability to grow fiber, but we have to look at it from a management position. It's not just how much can we re-go and how much per hectare, blah, blah, blah. It has to go beyond that in terms of the trees.
I would agree. 2 examples to this. Okay, so your lodgepole pine. If I was to tell you that our wonderful reforestation program that started in the, illegally started in the 80s here, which required the licensees to replant everything logged, it was a huge step forward. Okay, the free growing system came out of that idea. You had to plant the trees and get it to free to grow so that it would become a future crop.
86, 87.
Yeah, okay, but the problem is that there's the standards that government has set for what the licensees need to plant. Those are based on the days almost before lodgepole pine was seen to be a valuable species, especially the smaller diameter. Yeah. So the stocking standards we have are 35 years old. They're based on growing big trees quickly. And as you are alluding to, technology long ago fixed that need to have our fiber in big trees. We can do very well as long as the taper and the growth and the form of the tree is reasonable. We can do very well with our technology. So that's an example of where our forest management goals and objectives are still in the dark ages. They haven't evolved from where with technology, and we need to do that. The second one is something that's about Western red cedar on the coast. I think this is something, I'm not talking about the big old growth now. I'm talking about second growth Western red cedar.
Yeah.
In my career, 30 years, I've tracked the price of gang cedar from second growth. So this is a modest-sized log coming out of a second growth forest, usually, comparing it to hemlock and balsam and Douglas fir. Well, it's gone up. The trend is it varies over time. But overall, the value of that cedar has been 3 times the value of hemball, and 2 to 1.5 the times the value of Douglas fir. This has been a consistent trend for 30 years plus, okay? And yet, when I look at the number one value strategy from a forestry growth point of view would be growing Western red cedar where it's ecologically appropriate and managing the heck out of it to get our value per hectare on a harvest up substantially. Well, the problem is we haven't done that. Western red cedar gets planted on the poor sites where there's not too much grows, but really where we can grow other species, we perceive that we can grow them faster. We're a volume-based world, so we plant spruce, we plant Douglas fir, and we plant hemlock because we can get more volume, quote unquote. Well, if you look at where we sit on the coast now, it doesn't matter what the volume of your hemball stand is if it's up on the coast and with the high costs of harvesting and the values that we've seen over the last 20 years, you can't go and log that. You cannot go and log that.
No.
If it was a Western red cedar stand instead, you may have 10%, 5% less volume, but you'd have 3-4 times the revenue, and you'd have 3 to 4 times the areas to go log. So the value strategy that government has thrown out lately, I'm so frustrated in the fact that it hasn't made it through to what really needs to happen, which is we need to grow valuable timber in order to have a valuable manufacturing sector to build on. And so these are just examples, John, of I think we fall in love with the fact that silviculture and forestry, we got that under control. It's all good. We really don't need to improve much. We use genetically improved tree seed. We do all these things. We get good survival. But frankly, the opportunities for improvement are massive. And we're not coming close. And the bottom line to this is really, another professor said to me, look, when we started getting into the wars in the woods on the coast between different resource uses and setting aside lands, he said the number one response to this is zone off your forest land, set aside your conservation areas, leave them alone. But what you need to then do is have zones where you do more intensive forestry. And the studies show that economically you can grow as much fiber or more on a lesser of a land base. You can make more money doing it that way, and we need to do that. That was 20, 30 years ago. We haven't listened. We are talking about it again, but we seem to be talking only about the old growth deferral part. What we aren't talking about is that we also need this place in order to grow timber, in order to have a balance of economic, social, and environment.
And the interesting part about it, Jeff, is what I hear you saying is that, and I would agree with that, if that your land base or your working forest land base, talking interior, the coast would be the same in some different format. But if you look at that and you would be growing less, you use less of the timber growing area for timber that is used in sawmills, the likelihood if you used 1/3 of the area for other valuable things that you could do with it, and you managed it well, area rather than volume-based issues, and all those particular areas cumulative, you would grow a lot more AAC than you had even at the best of times now. It would, that the thing is self-defeating because the volume is not in the area. The volume is in how do you manage it and how do you bring it to market and all those things, and you end up with more volume available to the government, to the public, that would then get more money for it because it attracts more value out of the volume, more money out of the manufacturing. So everybody is a winner.
And I don't want you to get anybody of your listeners to get the impression that when I talk about more intensive forestry, that I'm talking about Brazil and cutting down rainforests and using herbicides extensively and cultivating the land and causing environmental destruction.
To the contrary.
I'm just talking about a relative shift in intensity, okay? I'm talking about doing everything well, right from harvesting right through to the planting, the tending, and I think a lot of those things can be done in very environmentally appropriate ways that will please the public and be reasonable solutions to what we're talking about. And that's not opposed to people who scaremonger that when Jeff says intensive forestry, that we're going to rape and pillage, we're going to create massive clear cuts that are going to be continuous and big, and we're going to plant all the same species everywhere, and it's going to look like a biodiversity hell. That is not what I see. I see
to the contrary.
I see small chunks of land that are managed intensively, but at different spatial and temporal stages, so that they look like a forest. They have attributes that serve wildlife and water and timber at different stages in their development, and they actually fit into a forest level plan that I think if we were able to show that to the public, they would go, whoa, that is actually pretty good.
So if we look at that in that way, Jeff, and I agree with you 100%, if there was ever a time to where we say what we are doing today is simply not working, it's not serving the public in a general sense, it's not serving communities well for an obvious reason, and that we have to start looking right from the ground up as redoing our forest policies as we go forward. And that includes what I always used to say with my friends, the major primaries. You can tell them anything, you can call them whatever you want to do, but don't talk. As soon as you say 10-year reform, they go like, that kind of a thing. Maybe now, the time has come that we collectively and as a government and as the 10-year holders, that the time has come to make changes to forest policy that will accomplish exactly what you were saying earlier, because that's what it will be, as any of the experts will say, that's the direction that you can go if we make those changes now. And if there ever was a time where the public is ready, the industry, I believe, will at some point have to get ready, because you cannot continue the way we are right now. If I look at the marketplace, because we are a global market in the forest industry, if I look at the marketplace, if I look at the US Southeast, they're paying about $45 a cubic meter to deliver the logs to the mill. If I look at BC interior, we're paying $100 if you are more, 110 if you are a 10-year holder. If you are relying on up to having to buy up to 50% or more, or somewhat more than that, you can be paying $150 to $200 a cubic meter. Well, you're simply not viable in manufacturing tubifors for the marketplace, because the market will continue to go up and down. And the next thing, if we believe that after the major downturns, because of all the things that have happened due to the reduction of the AEC, that it is over with. No, we'll see more mills closing down, more communities losing their employment, unless we are ready to start talking about what should it look like, how do we go through the midterm, and what does it look like once it is over.
I totally agree. I think that the time is now, but we've been saying this for a while. I've been waiting for 20 years, writing, talking to people like yourselves, trying to promote this change. I think that what I've learned, and what I would say right now, trying to be helpful and optimistic. This is going to be community driven. It has to, the focus of this debate needs to move to the communities and the regions where the forests grow. There needs to be a groundswell of this, and I think we're starting with that, with the First Nations having more of a voice. So getting them together with the rest of the communities and saying to the province of BC, thanks very much for some broad level guidance and policy, but we're going to figure this out ourselves. And we're going to tell you with a balance that we think we can achieve on this forest, and we're going to get at the business of managing this forest. And the industry, I think the mills that were built for the mountain pine beetle in the interior, they're no longer going to be viable for a reduced AAC moving forward. We need new mills. Where's the investment going to come for the new mills? The time is now to say we have a new model. There's going to be wood to buy. Entrepreneurs are going to be welcome. They need to know what's available from these regional areas, and they need to get at the business of thinking about what mills they can afford to build to support that.
Now, the other part that I was going to say, with all due respect, not being argumental here, but saying that 20 years ago, when the issues were raised by you and by others, that was 2003, 2004, in that area. That's when we had the mountain pine beetle for the next 20 years, and nearly 1 billion board feet of timber was given away for next to nothing because they were trying to get rid of it. So it created the impression of The AEC was at 80 million cubic meters annually. Timber stumpage was 25 cents a cubic meter. The wood was half that, so it didn't weigh all that much, and everybody was doing well. Now it's different. It's different in terms of, as you said, and I agree 100%, First Nations, communities, and the industry as a whole, if they want to survive here, they have to change the model.
Yeah, absolutely. We should have, in my opinion, this is where we haven't looked forward. I mean, when the mountain pine beetle happened, there was reasons for it. I think we haven't learned. I think you talked to Bruce about this. The fact is that we needed to understand that before the climate change discussion happened, we'd already done things to modify the forest substantially and set up risks that we shouldn't have been surprised at what could have happened. Then we went out and salvaged all this, but to me, what we didn't do is realize there was going to be significant social, economic, environmental consequences coming from this. Frankly, most of the money that went to government from the taxes and the stumpage should have gone into a special fund, and it should have been used to revamp the whole forest management framework to take advantage of a new world and start to grow the forest. We'd be 20 years along that line, John, right now, towards valuable forests for multiple different values. And we, on the coast, we'd be ready to harvest it in another 10 to 20. Some of it in the interior, we'd be a third of the way through the rotation. But forests take a long time to modify. You can't fix these things overnight. No. It takes the right policies to be in place, and then it takes years to fix some of the challenges that we're facing. And every year we let slide by, the challenges get more daunting and more. And so we really do need a revolution in thinking here, paradigm shift. And we really just don't have the leadership. There's too many people who are taking self-serving, one issue at a time approaches to this. They're very effective in social media, and they're very relevant and important issues, but they're not helping, because in the public's eye, all it is a whole bunch of concern for one or two things. We need to cohesively put this together and say, how can we address all of these things reasonably well? Never going to be perfect, but at least I think we can make a solid plan towards coming up with a more reasonable balance on this, but we're not even starting on that, really. I mean, forest landscape level planning, John, pilots are starting to go on now. That is a step in the right direction, but it takes tenure reform and taxation reform to support that. It'll be interesting to see, but literally this is going to take 5 to 15 years. We don't have 5 to 15 years. We need to be onto an enhanced change process very, very quickly.
As I do and as you do, Jeff, being part of this podcast is going broadly through the public, and they have, and the other ones that we have done, and hopefully that will help the process, at least of others looking at it. I believe, as we discussed, that politics is part of it in BC, where we're swinging every 4 years or every whatever, and we get different policy, and every 2 years a new Minister of Forest is not helpful. We must have longer-term strategic planning with the objectives of what we talked about. Communities are very much part of that, so is First Nations. And I've been busy in my life, in my own way, doing keynote addresses throughout the area wherever they give me an opportunity to speak about the issue. I spoke to the economic development people west of Vanderhoof, 25, 30 people last week. I will do more of that, talking about this and the opportunity. But I will not stop, neither will you. People like Rob Schutz and all the other experts are being much more vocal about it now, talking much more about it. And I think still, even today, as I'm sure you do, I look around the world, I still love Canada, I love British Columbia, I have a passion for the industry, I believe in the future, but we have to work together to bring the other parties on board, to make them understand it with all due respect better, because it's not all that simple. But once we do that, then I still believe that 20, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, maybe, people will be look back to this period in 2000 to 2023 to 2025, 26, changed forest policy in British Columbia, and they will look back like the Swedes did in Sweden, looking back 40 years and change the industry radically to where now they have too much fiber, not enough capacity, and a market that is a mixture of dimension lumber to a certain extent, but mainly value-added manufacturing, and that's the model.
I couldn't agree with you more. Sign me up, John. I'm happy to work with anyone who's as passionate as you are. I just think that I'm never going to give up. As long as I work and even into retirement. But I think I'm also someone who likes to be strategic, and I do think we need to move this conversation out to where the rubber's going to hit the road in the communities, and really leverage that type of thinking, and maybe that will lead to a bit of an uprising of public support for telling our provincial government that they want things to be done differently.
I appreciate you being a guest on my podcast on BC Forest Industry and Transition. I hope we stay in touch, and at some point in the future I can bring you back and kind of start updating and keep speaking about exactly what we talked about today.
No problem, John. I really enjoyed it, and good luck with your next podcast, and I'll be listening in.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Take care.
Okay. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.